Hey guys, welcome to Spinal Mobility and Superficial Core Muscles. In this video, we're going to go over what musculature do we use when we want to move our spine, how do we isolate different parts of our spine that we want to move while maintaining stability in other parts, and what muscles are we using to accomplish these things. So let's get started on our back. Knees are bent, feet are flat on the floor. I'm going to have my arms in a few different positions, kind of up here or down here. My goal is that I want you guys to be able to kind of see my torso moving. For you guys, the best place for your hands are just going to be kind of out flat on the floor, 45-degree angle or in a little bit closer, wherever they feel kind of natural. But if I move my hands up here, I don't want your guys' hands up above the head. I'm just doing that so you guys can see where my spine is at. Okay, so here, lying on our back, we're going to go through our points of our spine again. We have our sacrum, which is the lowest part attached to the floor. That runs from kind of the top of our butt crack to our waistband. That's 5 fused bones that is connected to the pelvis on either side and your lumbar spine at the top and your tailbone at the bottom. That should be lying flat on the floor when you're just lying on your back here. The next chunk of spine or vertebrae is your lumbar spine. Okay, that's your low back. That runs from like the top of your waistband to kind of the middle of your back, or the bottom of your rib cage is another way to think about it. When you get above, back to the lumbar spine quickly, when you're lying on your back, that should be slightly curved off the ground. So there's about centimeter to 3 centimeter gap between your lumbar spine and the ground. Then you have your thoracic vertebrae, which is supposed to lie flat on the floor. So that is from your mid-back, or where a bottom of a bra strap would be, all the way up to the base of your neck. And then you have your neck, or your cervical vertebrae. That, much like your lumbar vertebrae, should be curved off of the ground when you're just lying here. Okay, now I want to start by showing you that movement in one part of the spine will pull and move on another part of the spine. And we're going to use an exercise called the floor cog, C-O-G, the floor cog for this. Okay, you can think of it as cog, C-O-G, center of gravity. We're going to flex and extend our spine so that our center of gravity shifts a little bit. Okay, so I want to start by pressing our low back down into the floor. Do that slowly and see how much can you push down into the floor with your low back. Excuse me. Okay, so we're still pushing our low back down into the floor. And then I'm going to let it come off the floor. And I'm going to actively arch it as high off the floor as I can. Notice my tailbone now gets closer to the floor. My ribs kind of flare up off the floor. And this gap is enough for me to fit my whole arm underneath. Let's do that about 5 times. Slowly coming down, pushing your low back down into the floor. Try to do that with a little bit more force this time. And then slowly come back up and arch it off the floor. Let's see how high off the floor we can get. If you experience any pain in either position, do not push into the pain. Stop short of it. Let's come back down. We're going to press our low back down into the floor. At this point, if you're doing this at maximal end range, so really pushing that low back down and really arching that low back off the floor, bring your attention to your head. Your head is moving, or it should be moving, unless you are actively stabilizing it, which I did not instruct you to do, but you may be doing subconsciously. Try to relax the head. Keep moving the lumbar vertebrae through flexion and extension in its greatest range of motion. And if you keep the head relaxed, you will notice that my cervical vertebrae and head are moving opposite of the lumbar vertebrae. So when I press my lumbar vertebrae down into the ground, you will see that my chin is tilted up and backwards, and there's just more of a gap underneath my neck. If I arch my low back off of the floor or expand this space, you will notice that it pulls my chin down and it closes the gap between my neck and the floor. Let's do that one more time. Let's go down. See if you can allow the chin to rise up so that that gap between your neck and the floor increases. And then arch the lumbar vertebrae off the ground again. See if you can feel it pulling the chin down, getting the base of the neck closer to the floor, or the back of the neck closer to the floor. And relax. So that is called our floor cog. I'm going to run through that one more time here. And if you are having difficulty feeling the head move, I want you to try to do two things. Slow down the movement and try to go further with your lumbar spine in each direction. Doing that will help you feel how the head moves. The final thing that I want you to think about is relaxing your neck and jaw. We all carry tension, various amounts of tension in different places for whatever reason. You could be stressed, it could be an old injury, whatever. It's your job to learn how to turn down the tension and to turn up the tension, depending on what the activity is called for. In this case, we need to turn down the tension in our neck if it's feeling stiff and not moving, because subconsciously we can resist that secondary movement. And we don't want to do this. This is about spinal mobility. How do we increase the mobility of our spine? Okay, so let's try this cog one more time for a minute. And I'm going to talk us through this. During this, also try to maintain a slow, steady breath. I don't care how you're breathing in terms of timing breathing with the movement. We'll go over that in a later video. But keep a slow, steady breath. So I'm going to push the lumbar spine down into the ground. And I'm allowed to tilt my head backwards. And if I press harder, I can notice my tailbone kind of comes up off the floor. And my chin comes up off the floor. And then when I change directions with my lumbar spine and start to extend it, I can feel my head being pushed backwards, or my occipital protuberance starts to slide across the floor and latches back onto the floor, pulling my neck down as I'm actively pushing the lumbar spine up to the sky. I can also feel more of a lower part of my butt in contact with the ground, whereas that upper part of the butt kind of comes off the floor. So my pelvis is shifting, just like my head. Remember, head on one side, ribcage and head on one side, pelvis on the other side of the lumbar spine. So moving the lumbar spine, let's go back to lumbar flexion. Moving the lumbar spine is going to shift the pelvis, the skull, and the rib cage. That is the point I'm trying to make with this floor cog. Let's do one more lumbar extension. This is sometimes called anterior pelvic tilt. and relax. So, that set, you should have felt you're controlling your lumbar spine, but my pelvis, my ribs, and my head, keeping them all relaxed, are being pulled because of how I'm moving my lumbar spine. Okay? So, what muscles am I using to move my lumbar spine like that? And the answer is a few muscles that are superficial or closest to skin level, as opposed to deep muscles, which are closest to the organs. So, how am I going into lumbar flexion or pressing my lumbar spine down into the floor? What superficial muscle am I using to do that? The answer is your rectus abdominals or your six-pack muscles. The rectus abdominals attach to the bottom of the ribs right up here, and they act like a sheet running straight down to the top of your pubic bone. So as I push my lumbar spine down and this muscle from here to here is shortening, it's pulling my pelvis up towards my ribs, and or it's also pulling my ribs down towards my pelvis on the front side of my body. So it's creating space on the back part of my body, which is why it generally feels good on the back to push your lumbar spine down into the floor. It's creating space, also known as a stretch sensation. So, if my rectus abdominals are forcing this lumbar flexion or forcing my pelvis up towards my rib cage or my ribs down towards my pelvis, and it's stretching out my lumbar spine, that means that when we contract the abs, our low back muscles, they stretch. I want you to remember that. Now, if we go into the opposite position or lumbar extension, where I lift my low back off of the floor, here, my rectus abdominals are spreading out, or they're being stretched. And for some people, they will feel this stretch sensation. Others will not, for various reasons that we'll get into in future videos. But just know that the space from the top of your pelvis, which is right here to here, has now spread away from each other because I've created this mound. So the distance is further. I'm doing this by activating the muscles of my low back. And those muscles bring the back of my ribs towards the back of my pelvis. So the top of my pelvis is now closer towards the bottom of my ribs on the back side of my body. By contracting and pulling them into that position as my rectus abdominals get stretched out. In that position, this can be fatiguing or tight or even painful for some people. If you're experiencing pain in this extended position, you need to back off of it a little bit. You are not to go into that pain. You're only allowed to extend the lumbar vertebrae as far as pain allows. And we'll get into more of why that is later on. Let's go back to our lumbar flex position. And still keep everything up top relaxed, so I'm feeling my neck tilt. Now I'm feeling a good stretch in my back, and I should feel my rectus abdominals pushing down. So if I tap here, it's harder, okay? And then go back to your anterior tilt position or your lumbar extended position. Only go as far as pain allows, feeling a stretch, and then some tightness in the low back. Tightness is okay, pain is not. Remember, your low back has muscles. It should feel tight if you're using those muscles. And relax. Come back to neutral. So, what if I just want to activate my rectus abdominals and my lumbar spine without getting my neck and my upper back involved? That means I have to stabilize those areas. How do I do that? I'm going to enter my long neck position that we talked about in spinal stability video. I feel a stretch in my neck. I'm in my long lumbar position, and really overall my long spine position that we talked about in earlier videos. I'm going to push downward with my neck a little bit extra to help stabilize it there. And I'm going to focus on just moving the lumbar spine and the pelvis. So I shouldn't feel my rib cage change in position on the floor as I do this. I'm going to put my hands up here so you can see. Watch me do my pelvic tilts or my lumbar flexion and extension. Those are interchangeable words. As I keep my rib cage and head steady. There's my lumbar extension. It doesn't look like much because I'm stabilizing other parts of the spine, so I lose some range of motion. Now I'm going to go lumbar flexion. Breathing. This feels nice. I feel a good stretch in my back. Notice my head and rib cage have not moved. And now follow along with me. Stabilize the rib cage. We're going to work for about 1 minute here. Breathing. Slowly but surely, try to do it in and out of the nose. Notice my upper body hasn't moved, just my lumbar spine and pelvis. I'm now in lumbar extension or anterior pelvic tilt. I'm going to go back towards lumbar flexion. And I'm going to slowly press the low back down into the floor. Let's hold it here for one deep breath. Now on our transition back to lumbar extension, let's inhale. As we reach the furthest we can get into lumbar extension, let's exhale into it. So you see I'm exhaling and still moving. Try not to let the head or ribs move. Now I got to take another inhale. Let's transition back to lumbar flexion or posterior pelvic tilt on our inhale. And start to push down into the floor and exhale. So as you get to that end range, you're exhaling. One more rep totally through. Inhale, transition up to lumbar extension or anterior pelvic tilt. Exhale at end range. Inhale, reverse direction. Going back to lumbar flexion or posterior pelvic tilt. Start to exhale as you get to end range, which is pushing down into the ground. Keep pushing as long as you can exhale. And relax. So if you did that properly, you should have noticed that each rep got a little bit easier than the rep before. Now, what does easier mean? It means smoother movement, less restricted movement, and slightly further movement without sensations of stretch or pain. You're going to try this again at your own pace, where you are just moving through this lumbar flexion and extension, trying to inhale during the transition and exhale as you get into the end range. Each rep, you're going to try to grab a millimeter further of movement, and you're going to see if you can push the distance that you can get without pain. If you are truly relaxed, you will relax the pain sensation or your nervous system's perceived threat, and you will be able to get further. We're going to try this one more time at your own pace. I'm going to set a timer for a minute here. Let's start in our long spine position, and spine is neutral. Stabilize the head and the rib cage. Start breathing slowly. On your next inhale, let's lumbar extend or anterior pelvic tilt. Create that space between the lumbar spine and the floor. We're inhaling. As you feel like you're getting into end range, exhale. Try to get further. Once you need a breath, change directions. Inhaling. Once I get towards end range, exhale and push down. Once I need a breath again, change directions. Inhale. As I reach end range, exhale. Last time, need a deep breath in. Transition into lumbar flexion. As you get towards end range, exhale. If you're fully on the floor, the way that you increase range of motion is by pressing harder downward. Keep exhaling and relax. That is your floor cog, or the changing of your center of gravity. What I want you to get out of this video is that you can move one part of the spine, and it will try to move other parts of the spine and anything that's connected to it, meaning your ribs, your head, and your pelvis. But you can also move isolated areas of the spine while stabilizing other areas of the spine. As we get further along, we're going to explore deeper with the superficial rectus abdominis muscle and superficial low back muscle, and how they work together to create even more mobility of the spine. This has been spinal mobility and superficial core muscles.